forms were followed, however sparely, aiding her escape certainly had been treason, and deliberately countermanding an Amerlin's order just as much. Probably communicating with Althor was, too. That depended on what was communicated, with what intent. Finding who had changed the Amerlin's command would be difficult without knowing what command. At this late date, learning who might have helped Swan escape stood about as much chance of success as learning who might be writing to Althor. So many pigeons flew into and out of the tower cotes every day that at times the sky seemed to be raining feathers. If Elida knew more than she had said, she had certainly gone around the barn. This all made very little sense. Treason ought to make Elida boil with rage, but she had not been angry. She had been nervous, and anxious to be gone, and secretive, as if she did not want to tell everything she knew or suspected, almost as though she was afraid to. What kind of treason would make Elida nervous or afraid? Death and disaster for the whole tower. Like the pieces of a blacksmith's puzzle, all fell into place, and Siane's eyebrows tried to climb onto her scalp. It fit. It all fit. She felt the blood draining from her face. Her hands and feet were suddenly icy, sealed to the flame. She had said she would keep this in her heart, but everything had changed since she spoke those words. She only let herself be afraid when it was logical to be, and right then she was terrified. She could not face this alone. But who? Under the circumstances, who? This answer came much more easily. Gathering herself took a little time, but she hurried from her rooms and out of the white quarters, walking a good deal faster than she usually did. Servants scurried through the corridors as always, though she walked so quickly that she was past most before they could begin bow or curtsy, but there seemed fewer sisters about than the early hour could account for. Many fewer. Yet if most were staying close to their quarters for some reason, the few she saw made up for it in one way. Sisters swanned along the tapestry-hung hallways, faces all serenity, and their eyes seemed to have steam behind them. Here and there, 2 or 3 women spoke together, with sharp eyes darting to see who might be listening. Always 2 or 3 of the same Aja. Even yesterday she was sure she had still seen women sharing friendship between Ajas. Whites were supposed to put emotion away entirely, but she had never seen the reason for blinding herself as some did. Suspicion made the air in the tower like hot jelly. Not a new thing, unfortunately. The Amerlin had begun it with her harsh measures, and the rumors about Loghain had only exacerbated the situation, but this morning seemed worse than ever. Talene Minley came around a corner ahead of her, her shawl not just across her shoulders, but spread down her arms as though to display the green fringe. For that matter, she realized that every green she had seen this morning wore her shawl. Talene, golden-haired and statuesque and lovely, had stood to depose Swan, but she had come to the tower while Siane was accepted, and that decision had not dented their long friendship. Talene had had reasons Siane accepted, if not agreed with. Today her friend stopped, watching her warily. So many sisters seemed to watch one another that way of late. Another time she would have stopped, but not with what made her head want to burst open like a spoiled melon. Talene was a friend, and she thought she could be sure of her, but thinking was not enough for this. Later, if possible, she would approach Talene. Hoping it would be possible, she hurried past with only a nod. In the red quarter, the noise was even worse, the air thicker. As with the other Ajas, there were many more rooms than there were sisters to fill them now. That had been so long before the first rebel fled. But the red was the largest of the Ajas, and sisters filled the levels still in use. Reds frequently wore their shawls when there was no need, but now every last woman sported her red fringe like a banner. Conversation stopped as Siane approached, and cold eyes followed her in a bubble of icy silence. She felt an invader deep in enemy country as she crossed those peculiar floor tiles, white with the teardrop flame of Tarvalin in red. But then any part of the tower might be enemy country. Looking another way, those scarlet flames might be taken for red dragons' fangs. She had never believed those irrational tales about the Reds and false dragons, but why would none of them deny it? She had to ask directions. "I will not disturb her if she is busy," she said. "We were close friends once, and I would like us to be again. Now more than ever the Ajas cannot afford to drift apart." All true, though the Ajas seemed to be splitting apart rather than drifting, but the Domani woman listened with a face that could have been cast in copper. There were not many Domani Reds, and those few usually meaner than snakes caught in a fence. "I will show you, sitter," the woman said at last, and not very respectfully. She led the way, then watched while Siain knocked on the door, as though she could not be trusted here alone. The door panels were carved with the flame, too, lacquered the color of fresh blood. "Come," a brisk voice called from within. Siain opened the door, hoping she was right. "Siain!" Pevara exclaimed cheerfully. "What brings you here this morning? Come, shut the door and sit." It was as if all the years since they were novice and accepted together had melted away. Quite plump and not tall, in truth, for a Kandori she was short, Pevara was also quite pretty, with a merry twinkle in her dark eyes and a ready smile. It was sad that she had chosen red, no matter how good her reasons, because she still liked men. The red did attract women who were naturally suspicious of men, of course, but others chose it because the task of finding men who could channel was important. Whether they liked men or disliked them, or did not care one way or the other in the beginning, however, not many women could belong to the Red for long without taking a jaundiced view of all men. Siain had reason to believe Pevara had served a penance shortly after attaining the shawl, for saying that she wished she had a warder. Since reaching the safer heights of the hall, she had openly said warders would make the Red Aja's work easier. Not that that had any part in Siain trusting her. Of all the sisters in the tower, though, Pevara was the one she was sure she could trust with this. "I cannot tell you how happy I am to see you," Pevara said once they were ensconced in armchairs, carved in the spirals popular in Kandor 100 years ago, with delicate butterfly-painted cups of blueberry tea in hand. "I have often thought how I should go to you, but I admit to fearing what you would say after I gave you the cut direct so many years ago. Sworn on the blade, Siain, I'd not have done it, except Tessian Jorhald practically had me by the scruff of my neck, and I was too new to the shawl to have much backbone yet. Can you forgive me?" "Of course I can," Siain replied. "I understood." The Red firmly discouraged friendships outside the Aja, quite firmly and quite efficiently. "We cannot go against our Ajas when we are young, and later it seems impossible to retrace our steps. 1,000 times I've remembered us whispering together after last. Oh, and the pranks! Do you recall when we dusted Sarancha's shift with powdered itch oak? But I'm shamed to say it took being terrified out of my wits to stir my feet. I do want us to be friends again, but I need your help, too. You are the only one I'm sure I can trust." "Sarancha was a prig then and still is," Pevara laughed. "The Grey is a good place for her. But I can't believe you terrified at anything. Why, you never decided it was logical to be afraid until we were back in our beds. Short of a promise to stand in the hall without knowing what for, whatever help I can give is yours, Siain. What do you need?" Brought to the point, Siain hesitated, sipping her tea. Not that she had any doubts about Pevara, but pushing the words out of her mouth was difficult. "The Amerlin came to see me this morning," she said finally. "She instructed me to make an inquiry, sealed to the flame." Pevara frowned slightly, but she did not say that in that case Siain should not be speaking of it. Siain might have planned how to carry out most of their pranks as girls, but Pevara had been the one with the audacity to think most of them up, and she had provided most of the nerve to go through with them. She was very circumspect, but after a little thought, it was clear to me what she wanted. I am to hunt out... At the last, courage failed her tongue. Dark friends in the tower. Vivara's eyes, as dark as her own were blue, became stone and swept the mantel above her fireplace, where miniatures of her own family made a precise line. They had all died while she was a novice. Parents, brothers and sisters, aunts, uncles, and all, murdered in a quickly suppressed uprising of Dark Friends, who had become convinced the Dark One was about to break free. That was why Siain had been sure she could trust her. That was why Pivara had chosen red, though Siain still thought she could have done as well and been happier as a green, because she believed a red hunting men who could channel had the best chance of finding Dark Friends. She had been very good at it. That plump exterior covered a core of steel, and she possessed the courage to say calmly what Siain had been unable to bring herself to utter. The Black Ajah. Well, no wonder Elida would be circumspect. Pivara, I know she's always denied its existence harder than any 3 other sisters combined, but I'm certain sure that's what she meant, and if she is convinced... Her friend waved her off. You have no need to convince me, Siain. I have been sure the Black Ajah exists for... Strangely, Pivara became hesitant, peering into her teacup like a fortune-teller at a fair. What do you know of events right after the Aiel War? 2 Amerlins dying suddenly in the space of 5 years, Siain said carefully. She assumed the other woman meant events in the tower. Truth to tell, until being raised a sitter nearly 15 years ago, just a year after Pivara, she had not given much attention to anything outside the tower. And not that much inside, really. A great many sisters died in those years, as I recall. Do you mean to say you think the Black Ajah had a hand in that? There, she had said it, and the name had not burned her tongue. I don't know, Pivara said softly, shaking her head. You've done well to wrap yourself deep in philosophy. There were things done then and sealed to the flame. She drew a troubled breath. Siain did not press her. She herself had committed something akin to treason by breaking that same seal, and Pivara would have to decide on her own. Looking at reports will be safer than asking questions with no idea who we're really asking. Logically, a Black Sister must be able to lie despite the oaths. Otherwise, the Black Ajah would have been revealed long since. That name seemed to be coming more easily with use. If any sister wrote that she did one thing when we can prove she did another, then we have found a Dark Friend. Pivara nodded. Yes. Perhaps the Black Ajah has no hand in the rebellion, but I cannot think they would let this turmoil pass without taking advantage. We must look closely at this last year, I think. To that, Siain agreed reluctantly. There would be fewer pieces of paper to read and more questions to ask concerning recent months. Deciding who else to make part of the inquiry was even harder, especially after Pivara said, You were very brave coming to me, Siain. I've known Dark Friends to kill brothers, sisters, parents, to try hiding who they are and what they've done. I love you for it, but you were very brave indeed. Siain shivered as if a goose had walked on her grave. Had she wanted to be brave, she would have chosen green. She almost wished Elida had gone to someone else. There was no turning back now, though.
Chapter 33. A Bath. The days after sending Perrin away seemed endless to Rand, and the nights longer. He retreated to his rooms and stayed there, telling the maidens to allow no one to enter. Only Nandera was allowed past the doors with the Gilded Suns, bringing his meals. The sinewy maiden would set down a covered tray and list those who had asked to see him, then give him a look of rebuke when he repeated that he would see no one. Often he heard disapproving comments from the maidens outside before she pulled the door shut behind her. He was intended to hear, else they would have used hand talk. But if they thought to chivvy him out by claiming that he was sulking, the maidens did not understand, and might not if he explained, if he could have brought himself to. He picked at the meals without appetite and tried to read, but his favorite books could divert him for only a few pages, even in the beginning. At least once every day, though he had promised himself he would not, he lifted the massive of polished black wood and ivory in his bedchamber, floated it aside on flows of air, and carefully unraveled the traps he had set and the mask of mirrors that made the wall seem smooth, all inverted so no other eyes but his could see. There, in a niche hollowed out with the power, stood two small statues of white stone about a foot tall, a woman and a man, each in flowing robes and holding a clear crystal sphere overhead in one hand. The night he set the army in motion toward Ilion, he had gone to Rudion alone to fetch these tir-en-grial. If he needed them, he might not have much time. That was what he had told himself. His hand would stretch toward the bearded man, the only one of the pair a man could use, stretch out and stop, shaking. One finger touching, and more of the one power than he could imagine could be his. With that, no one could defeat him, no one stand against him. With that, Lanfear said once, he could challenge the Creator. "It is mine by right," he muttered each time, with his hand trembling just short of the figure. "Mine. I am the Dragon Reborn." And each time, he made himself draw back, reweaving the mask of mirrors, reweaving the invisible traps that would burn anyone to a cinder who tried to pass them without the key. The huge wardrobe wafted back into place like a feather. He was the Dragon Reborn, but was that enough? It would have to be. "I am the Dragon Reborn," he whispered at the walls sometimes, and sometimes shouted at them. "I am the Dragon Reborn." Silently and aloud he raged at those who opposed him, the blind fools who could not see, and those who refused to see, for ambition, or avarice, or fear. He was the Dragon Reborn, the only hope of the world against the Dark One, and the light helped the world for it. But his rages and thoughts of using the tir-en-grial were only attempts to escape other things, and he knew it. Alone, he picked at his meals, though less every day, and tried to read, though seldom, and attempted to find sleep. That he tried more often as the days passed, not caring whether the sun was down or high. Sleep came in fitful snatches, and what harrowed his waking thoughts also stalked his dreams and chased him awake too soon for any rest. No amount of shielding could keep out what was already inside. He had the Forsaken to face, and sooner or later the Dark One himself. He had fools who fought him or ran away when their only hope was to stand behind him. Why would his dreams not let him be? From one dream, he always sprang awake before it more than began, to lie there filled with self-loathing and muddled with lack of sleep. But the others, he deserved them all, he knew. Colliver confronted him sleeping, her face black and the scarf she had used to hang herself still buried in the swollen flesh of her neck. Colliver silent and accusing, with all the maidens who had died for him arrayed behind her in silent, staring ranks. All the women who died because of him. He knew every face as well as his own, and every name but one. From those dreams, he woke weeping. 100 times he hurled Perrin across the Grand Hall of the Sun, and 100 times he was overwhelmed by blazing fear and rage. 100 times he killed Perrin in his dreams and woke to his own screams. Why had the man chosen the Aes Sedai prisoners to use for their argument? Rand tried not to think about them. He had done his best to ignore their existence from the beginning. They were too dangerous to keep long as captives, and he had no idea what to do with them. They frightened him. Sometimes he found inside the box again. Of Galena and Arian and Katarine, and the rest taking him out to beat him. Drained and woke whimpering, even after he convinced himself his eyes were open and he was outside. They frightened him because he feared he might give way to the fear and the anger, and then... He tried not to think of what he might do then. But sometimes he dreamed it, and woke shaking in a cold sweat. He would not do that. Whatever he had done, he would not do that. In dreams, he gathered the Ashaman to attack the White Tower and punish Elida. He leaped from a gateway filled with righteous anger and Sayadine and learned that Alviaran's letter had been a lie. Saw her stand alongside Elida. Saw Egwene beside her too, and Nynaeve, and even Elaine. All with Aes Sedai faces, because he was too dangerous to let run free. He watched the Ashaman destroyed by women who had years of studying the one power behind them, not just a few months of hard. And from those dreams he could never wake until every man in a black coat was dead, and he stood alone to face the might of the Aes Sedai. Alone. Again and again, Cadsuane spoke those words about madmen hearing voices, till he flinched at them as at blows of a whip, flinched in his sleep when she appeared. In dreams and waking, he called to Lews Therin, shouted at him, screamed for him, and only silence answered. Alone. That small bundle of sensations and emotions in the back of his head, the sense of Alana's almost touch, slowly became a comfort. In many ways, that frightened him most of all. On the fourth morning, he woke groggily from a dream of the White Tower, flinging up a hand to shield grainy eyes from what he thought was a flare of Sayadar-wrought fire. Dust motes sparkled in the sunlight streaming through the window to reach his bed, with its great square blackwood posts inlaid with ivory wedges. Every piece of furnishing in the room was polished blackwood and ivory, square and stark and heavy enough to suit his mood. For a moment he lay there, but if sleep returned, it would only bring another change. He thought without any hesitation, and rarely pushed himself to his feet, hugging his wrinkled coat straight. He had not changed his clothes since first shutting himself away. When he staggered into the anteroom, at first he thought he was dreaming again, the dream that always woke him straight off in shame and guilt and loathing. But Min looked up at him from one of the tall gilded chairs, a leather-bound book on her knees, and he did not wake. Dark ringlets framed her face, big dark eyes so intent he almost felt her touch. Her breeches of brocaded green silk fit her like a second skin, and her coat of matching silk hung open, a cream-colored blouse rising and falling with her breath. He prayed to wake. It had not been fear or anger or guilt over Colliver or Lews Therin's disappearance that drove him to shut himself away. "There's a feast of sorts in 4 days," she said brightly, "at the half-moon. The Day of Repentance, they call it for some reason. But there will be dancing that night. Sedate dancing, I hear, but any dancing is better than none." Carefully tucking a thin strip of leather into the book, she placed it on the floor beside her. "That's just time to have a dress made if I set the seamstress to work today. That is, if you mean to dance with me." He pulled his gaze away from her, and it fell on a cloth-covered tray beside the tall doors. Just the thought of food made him queasy. Nandera was not supposed to let anyone in, burn her, least of all Min. He had not mentioned her by name, but he had said no one. "Min, I don't know what to say. Sheepherder, you look like what the dogs over. Now I understand why Alana was so frantic, even if I don't see how she knew. She practically begged me to speak to you, after the maidens turned her away for about the 5th time. Nandera wouldn't have let me in if she wasn't in a lather about you not eating, and even so I had to do a little begging myself. You owe me, country boy." Rand flinched. Images of himself flashed in his head. Him tearing at her clothes, forcing himself on her like a mindless beast. He owed her more than he could ever pay. Raking a hand through his hair, he made himself turn to face her. She had tucked her feet up so she sat cross-legged in the chair, leaning her fists on her knees. How could she look at him so calmly? "Min, there's no excuse for what I did. If there was any justice, I'd go to the gallows. If I could, I'd put the rope around my neck myself. On oath I would." The words tasted bitter. He was the dragon reborn, and she would have to wait on justice until the last battle. What a fool he had been to want to live past Tarmangaten. He did not deserve to. What are you talking about, sheepherder? She said slowly. I'm talking about what I did to you, he groaned. How could he have done that to anyone, but most of all to her? Min, I know how hard it is for you to be in the same room with me. How could he recall the soft feel of her so, the silkiness of her skin, after he had torn her clothes off? I never thought I was an animal, a monster. But he was. He loathed himself for what he had done, and loathed himself worse because he wanted to do it again. The only excuse I have is madness. Cat Swain was right. I did hear voices. Luz Theron's voice, I thought. Can you? No. No, I have no right to ask you to forgive me. But you have to know how sorry I am, Min. He was sorry, and his hands ached to run down her bare back, over her hips. He was a monster. Bitterly sorry. At least know that. She sat there motionless, staring at him as if she never before had seen his like. Now, she could stop pretending. Now she could say what she really thought of him, and however vile it would not be half vile enough. So that's why you've been keeping me away, she said finally. You listen to me, you wooden-headed numbskull. I was ready to cry myself to dust because I'd seen one death too many, and you were about to do the same for the same reason. What we did, my innocent lamb, was comfort one another. Friends comfort one another at times like that. Close your mouth, you Two Rivers hay-hair. He did, but only to swallow. He thought his eyes were going to fall onto the floor stones. He nearly spluttered, getting words out. Comforted? Men, if the women's circle back home heard what we did called comforting, they'd be lining up to peel our hides if we were 50. At least it's we now instead of I, she said grimly. Rising smoothly, she advanced toward him, shaking a furious finger. Do you think I'm a doll, farm boy? Do you think I am too dim-witted to let you know if I didn't want your touch? Do you think I couldn't let you know in no uncertain terms? Her free hand produced a knife from under her coat, gave it a flourish, and tucked it back without slowing the torrent. I remember ripping your shirt off your back because you couldn't pull it over your head fast enough to suit me. That's how little I wanted your arms around me. I did with you what I've never done with any man, and don't think I was never tempted. And you say it was all you. As if I wasn't even there. The back of his legs hit a chair, and he realized he'd been backing away from her. Frowning up at him, she muttered, I don't think I like you looking down at me right now. Abruptly, she kicked him hard on the shin, planted both hands on his chest, and shoved. He toppled into the chair so hard, it nearly went over backward. Ringlets swayed as she gave her head a toss and adjusted her brocaded coat. That's as may be, Min, but that's as is, sheep herder, she cut in firmly. And if you say different again, you had best shout for the maidens and channel for all you're worth, because I'll thump you around this room till you squeal for mercy. You need a shave. And a bath. Rand took a deep breath. Perrin had such a serene marriage with a smiling, gentle wife. Why was it that he always seemed drawn to women who spun his head like a top? If only he knew the 10th part of what Matt did about women, he would have known what to say to all that. But as it was, all he could do was blunder on. In any case, he said cautiously, there's only one thing I can do. And what might that be? She folded her arms tight beneath her breast, and her foot began tapping ominously. But he knew this was the right thing to do. Send you away. Just as he had Elaine and Avienda. If I had any self-control, I wouldn't have... That foot started tapping faster. Maybe better to leave that alone. Comforted. Light. Men, anyone close to me is in danger. The Forsaken aren't the only ones who would harm somebody near me just on the chance it might harm me too. And now there's me as well. I can't control my temper anymore. Min, I nearly killed Perrin. Cadswain was right. I'm going mad, or there already. I have to send you away so you'll be safe. Who is this Cadswain? She said, so calmly that he gave a start at noticing that her foot was still tapping. Alana mentioned that name as if she was the Creator's sister. Now don't tell me I don't care. Not that she gave him one hair or anything. I don't care about Perrin either. You would hurt me as soon as him. I think that great public fight of yours was a fake, is what I think. I don't care about your temper, and I don't care whether you're mad. You can't be very mad, or you'd not be worrying about it so. What I do care about... She bent until those very big, very dark eyes were level with his, not a great distance away. And suddenly there was such a light glaring in them that he seized Sayadine, ready to defend himself. Send me away to be safe? She growled. How dare you? What right do you think you have to send me anywhere? You need me, Randall Thor. If I told you half the viewings I've had about you, half your hair would curl and the rest would fall out. You let the maidens face any risk they want, and you want to send me away like a child? I don't love the maidens. Floating deep in the emotionless void.
Cheers, Chris. How you doing today? Or this evening?
And shock shattered the emptiness and sent Sayadine flying.
Salut, Chris. J'espère que tu vas bien.
Well, Min said, straightening. A small smile added more curve to her lips. That's out of the way. And she sat down on his lap. She had said he would not hurt Perrin any more than he would her, but he had to hurt her now. He had to, for her own good. I love Elaine, too, he said brutally. And Avienda. You see what I am? For some reason, that did not seem to faze her at all. Ruark loves more than one woman, she said. Her smile seemed almost of Aes Sedai serenity. So does Bale. And I never noticed any Trollocs horns on either. No, Rand. You love me, and you can't back out of that. I ought to string you up on tenterhooks for what you've put me through, but... just so you'll know, I love you too. The smile faded in a frown of internal struggle, and finally she sighed. Life would be a deal easier sometimes if my aunts hadn't brought me up to be fair, she muttered. And to be fair, Rand, I have to tell you that Elaine loves you too. So does Avienda. If both of Mandelaine's wives can love him, I suppose 3 women can manage to love you. But I'm here, and if you try to send me away, I'll tie myself to your leg. Her nose wrinkled. Once you start bathing again, anyway. But I won't go no matter what. Just exactly like a top, his head spun. You love me? He said incredulously. How do you know what Elaine feels? How do you know anything about Avienda? Right. Mandalay can do what he likes, men. I'm not Aiel. He frowned. What was that you said about telling me half of what you see? I thought you told me everything. And I am, too, sending you somewhere safe. And stop doing your nose like that. I don't smell. He jerked the hand he'd been scratching with from under his coat. Her arched eyebrows spoke volumes, but of course her tongue had to have its bit, too. You dare take that tone? Like you don't believe it? Her voice began to rise by the word, and she augured a finger against his chest, as though she meant to drive it through.
That was a good hit there.
Do you think I'd go to bed with a man I did not love? Do you? Or maybe you think you aren't worth loving, is that it? She made a sound like a stepped-on cat. So I'm some little bit of fluff without a brain in her head, falling in love with a worthless lout, am I? You sit there gaping like a sick ox and slander my wits, my taste, my... If you don't quiet down and talk sense, he growled, I swear I'll smack your bottom. That leaped out of nowhere, out of sleepless nights and confusion. But before he could begin to form an apology, she smiled. The woman smiled. At least you're not sulking anymore, she said. Don't ever whine, Rand. You're no good at it. Now then, you want sense? I love you, and I will not go. If you try to send me away, I'll tell the maidens you ruined me and cast me aside. I'll tell everybody who will listen. I will... He raised his right hand and studied the flat of his palm, where the branded heron stood clear, then looked at her. She eyed his hand warily and shifted herself on his knees, then conspicuously ignored everything except his face. I won't go, Rand, she said quietly. You need me. How do you do it? He sighed, slumping back in the chair. Even when you stand me on my head, you make all my troubles shrink. Min sniffed. You need to be stood on your head more often. Tell me, this Avienda, I don't suppose there's any chance she's bony and scarred like Nandera.
Give me 1 second, I'll be right back.
Like, how long since he had laughed with pleasure. Min, I'd say she is as pretty as you, but how can you compare two sunrises? For a moment, she stared at him with a small smile, as if she could not decide whether to be surprised or delighted. You are a very dangerous man, Randolph Thor, she murmured, leaning toward him slowly. He thought he might fall into her eyes and be lost. All those times before when she sat on his lap and kissed him, all those times he had thought she was only teasing a country boy, he had nearly crawled out of his skin wanting to kiss her forever. Now, if she kissed him again now... Taking her firmly by the arms, he stood and set her on her feet. He loved her, and she loved him, but he had to remember that he wanted to kiss Elaine forever when he thought about her, and Avienda. Whatever Min said about Ruark or any Aielman, she had made a poor bargain the day she fell in love with him. You said half, Min, he said quietly. What viewings haven't you told me? She looked up at him with what almost might have been frustration, except, of course, that it could not have been. You're in love with the Dragon Reborn, Min Farshaw, she grumbled, and best you remember it. Best you did too, Rand, she added, pulling away. He let her go reluctantly, eagerly. He did not know which. You've been back in Carrion half a week, and you still have done nothing about the sea folk. Berlin thought you might drag your feet again. She left me a letter asking me to keep reminding you. Only you wouldn't let me... Well, never mind that. Berlin thinks they're important to you somehow. She says you're the fulfillment of some prophecy of theirs. I know all about that, Min. He had thought to leave the sea folk out of being tangled with him. They were not mentioned in the prophecies of the dragon that he could find. But if he was going to let Min stay near him, let her risk the dangers, she had won, he realized. He had watched Elaine walk away with his heart sinking, watched Avienda go with his stomach in knots. He could not do it again. Min stood there waiting. I'll go to their ship. I'll go today. The sea folk can kneel to the Dragon Reborn in all his splendor. I don't suppose there was ever any hope for anything else. Either they're mine or they're my enemies. That is how it always seems to be. Will you tell me about those viewings now? Rand, you should study what they're like before you... The viewings? She folded her arms and frowned up at him through her lashes. She chewed her lip and frowned at the door. She shook her head and muttered under her breath. At last, she said, there was only one, really. I was exaggerating. I saw you and another man. I couldn't make out either face, but I knew one was you. You touched and seemed to merge into one another. And her mouth tightened worriedly, and she went on in a very small voice. I don't know what it means, Rand, except that one of you dies and one doesn't. Why are you grinning? This isn't a joke, Rand. I do not know which of you dies. I'm grinning because you've given me very good news, he said, touching her cheek. The other man had to be Lews Therin. I'm not just insane and hearing voices, he thought, jubilant. One lived and one died, but he had known for a long time that he was going to die. At least he was not mad, or not as far mad as he had feared. There was still the temper he could barely control. You see, Suddenly he realized that he had gone from touching her cheek to cupping her face in both hands. He pulled them away as if burned. Min pursed her lips and gave him a reproving look, but he was not going to take advantage of her. It would not be fair to her. Luckily, his stomach rumbled loudly. I need something to eat if I'm going to see the sea folk. I saw a tray. Min made a sound more snort than sniff as he turned away, but the next moment she was sailing toward the tall doors. You need a bath if we're going to the sea folk. Nandera was delighted, nodding enthusiastically and sending maidens running. Though she did lean close to Min and say, I should have let you in the first day. I wanted to kick him, but it is not done, kicking the Khan. By her tone, it should have been done. She spoke softly, yet not so softly he could not hear. He was sure that was deliberate. She directed too sharp a glare at him for it not to be. Maidens lugged in the big copper tub themselves, flashing hand talk once they sat down, laughing and too excited to let the Sun Palace servants do the work, or bring in the stream of buckets filled with hot water either. Rand had a hard time taking his own clothes off. For that matter, he had a hard time washing himself, and he could not escape Nandera lathering his hair. Flaxen-haired Somera and fiery-haired Anila insisted on shaving him as he sat chest-deep in the tub, concentrating so intently they seemed afraid they might cut his throat. He was used to that from other times they had refused to let him handle brush and razor himself. He was used to the maidens who stood around watching, offering to scrub his back or his feet, hands flickering in silent chatter, still more than half scandalized at the sight of someone sitting in water. Besides, he managed to get rid of some, at least, by sending them off carrying orders. What he was not used to was Min, sitting cross-legged on the bed with her chin on her hands, watching the whole thing in very evident fascination. In all the crowd of maidens, he had not realized she was there until he was naked, and all there was to do then was sit down as fast as he could, splashing water over the sides of the tub. The woman would have done very well as a maiden herself. She discussed him with the maidens quite openly, with no blush. He was the one who blushed. Yes, he is very modest, she said, agreeing with Malandera, a woman more rounded than most maidens, with the darkest hair Rand had seen on any Aiel. Modesty is a man's crowning glory. Malandera nodded soberly, but Min wore a grin that nearly split her cheeks. And, oh no, Delilah, it would be a shame to spoil such a pretty face with a scar. Delilah, grayer than Nandera, leaner, and with a thrusting chin, insisted that he was not pretty enough to do without a scar to set off what beauty he had. Her words. The rest was worse. The maidens had always seemed to enjoy making his hair red. Min certainly did. You have to dry off sooner or later, Rand, she said, holding up a long piece of white toweling with both hands. She stood a good 3 paces from the tub, and the maidens had all backed into a watching ring. Min's smile was so innocent, any magistrate would have found her guilty on that alone. Come and get dry, Rand. He had never been so relieved to pull on clothes in his life. By that time, all his orders had been carried out, and everything was in readiness. Randolph Thor might have been routed in a bathtub, but the Dragon Reborn was going to the sea folk in a style that would send them plummeting to their knees with awe. Chapter 34. Taviran. All was ready as Rand had ordered in the courtyard at the front of the Sun Palace. Or almost all. The morning sun slanted shadows from the stepped towers, so only 10 paces in front of the tall bronze gates lay in full light. Dashiva and Flynn and Narishima, the 3 Ashaman he had retained, waited beside their horses. Even Dashiva was resplendent with the silver sword and red and gold dragon collar, though he still touched the sword at his hip as if constantly surprised to find it there. 100 of Dobrain's armsmen sat their mounts behind Dobrain himself, with 2 long banners that hung down in the still air, their dark armor newly lacquered so it glistened in the sun, and silk streamers of red and white and black tied below the heads of their lances. They raised a cheer when Rand appeared, his sword belt with its gilded dragon buckle strapped over a red coat heavy with gold. Althor, Althor, Althor filled the courtyard. People crowding the archers' balconies joined in, Tyron and Carienen in their silks and laces, who just a week before had no doubt cheered Colaver as loudly. Men and women who would as soon he had never returned to Carien, some of them waving their arms and giving voice.
That was this one.
He raised the dragon scepter to acknowledge them, and they roared loudly. A thunderous roll of drums and a blare of trumpets rose through the cheers, produced by very multiple men who wore crimson tabards with the black and white disc on the chest, half carrying long trumpets draped in identical cloths, the other half with kettle drums also decorated, slung on either side of the horses. 5 Aes Sedai in their shawls came to meet him as he descended the broad stairs. At least, they glided toward him. Alana gave him one searching look with those big, dark, penetrating eyes. The tiny knot of emotions in his skull said she was calmer, more relaxed than he ever remembered. Then she made a small motion, and Min touched his arm and went aside with her. Bera and the others made small curtsies, inclining their heads slightly, as Aiel streamed out of the palace behind him. Nandera led 200 maidens. They were not about to be outshone by the Oathbreakers, and Kamar, a rangy, bent-peaked Darine, grayer than Nandera and half a head taller than Rand, led 200 Seyadun, who would not be outshone by Fardarai's Mai, let alone Carienen. They swung past on either side of him in the Aes Sedai to ring the courtyard. Bera, like a proud farm wife, and Alana, like some darkly beautiful queen in their green-fringed shawls, and plump Raphella, even darker wrapped in her blue, watching him anxiously, and cool-eyed Phaedron, yet another green, her thin braids worked with colored beads, and slim Marana in her gray, whose frown made Raphella seem a picture of Aes Sedai serenity. 5. Where are Karuna and Varen? He demanded. I called for all of you. So you did, my Lord Dragon, Bera answered smoothly. She made another curtsy, too. Only the slightest dip, but it took him aback. We could not find Varen. She is somewhere in the Aiel tents. Questioning the... Her smooth tone faltered for one instant. The prisoners, I believe, in an attempt to learn what was planned once they reached Tarvalin. Once he reached Tarvalin. She knew enough not to blurt that where anyone could hear. And Karuna is consulting with Soralia on a matter of protocol. But I'm quite certain she will be more than happy to join us if you send a personal summons to Soralia. I could go myself if you... He waved that away. 5 should be enough. Perhaps Varen could learn something. Did he want to know? And Karuna. A matter of protocol? I'm glad you are getting on with the wise ones. Bera started to speak, then closed her mouth firmly. Whatever Alana was saying to Min, scarlet spots had flared in Min's cheeks, and she had raised her chin, though oddly she seemed to be replying calmly enough. He wondered whether she would tell him. One thing he was sure of about women was that every last one had secret places in her heart, sometimes shared with another woman, but never with a man. The only thing he was sure of about women. I didn't come out here to stand all day, he said irritably. The Aes Sedai had arranged themselves with Bera in the lead, the others half a step back. If it had not been her, it would have been Karuna. Their own arrangements, not his. He did not really care so long as they held to their oaths, and he might have left it alone if not for Min and Alana. Marana will speak for you from now on. You will take your orders from her. By the suddenly widened eyes, you would have thought he had slapped every one of them, including Marana. Even Alana's head whipped around. Why should they be startled? True, Bera and Karuna had done almost all the talking since Dumai's Wells, but Marana had been the ambassador sent to him at Camelin. "If you are ready, Min," he said, and without waiting for a reply, strode out into the courtyard. The big, fiery-eyed black gelding he had ridden back from Dumai's Wells had been brought out for him, with a high-cantled saddle all worked in gold, and a crimson saddlecloth embroidered with a disc of black and white at each corner. The trappings suited the animal and his name. Taidashar, in the old tongue, Lord of Glory. Horse and trappings both suited the dragon reborn. As he mounted, Min led up the mouse-colored mare she had ridden back, snugging on her riding gloves before swinging into the saddle. "Sayer is a fine animal," she said, patting the mare's arched neck. "I wish she was mine. I like her name, too. We call the flower a blue-eye around Berlon, and they grow everywhere in the spring." "She's yours," Rand said. Whichever Aes Sedai the mare belonged to would not refuse to sell to him. He would give Karuna 1,000 crowns for Taidashar. She could not complain then. The finest stallion of Tyran bloodstock never cost 1/10 of that. "Did you have an interesting conversation with Alana?" "Nothing that would interest you," she said offhandedly. But a faint touch of red stained her cheeks. He snorted softly, then raised his voice. "Lord Dobrain, I've kept the sea folk waiting long enough, I think." The procession drew crowds along the broad avenues and filled the windows and rooftops as word raced ahead. 20 of Dobrain's lancers led to clear the way, along with 30 maidens and as many black eyes, then drummers booming away, drum, 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 and the trumpeters punctuating that with flourishes. Shouts from the onlookers nearly drowned drums and trumpets alike, a wordless roar that could have been rage as easily as approbation. The banners streamed out just ahead of Dobrain and behind Rand, the white dragon banner and the scarlet banner of the light, and veiled Aiel trotted alongside the lancers, whose streamers also floated in the air. Now and then, a few flowers were hurled at him. Maybe they did not hate him. Maybe they only feared. It had to do. "A train worthy of any king," Marana said loudly, to be heard. "Then it's enough for the Dragon Reborn," he replied sharply. "Will you stay back? And you too, Min." Other rooftops held assassins. The arrow or crossbow bolt meant for him would not find its target in a woman today. They did fall back behind his big black, for all of 3 paces, and then they were right beside him again, Min telling him what Berlain had written about the sea folk on the ships, about the Jendai prophecy and the Koramur, and Marana adding what she knew of the prophecy, though she admitted that was not very much, little more than Min. Watching the rooftops, he listened with half an ear. He did not hold Sayadine, but he could feel it in Dashiva and the other 2, right behind him. He did not feel the tingle that would announce the Aes Sedai embracing the source, but he had told them not to, without permission. Perhaps he should change that. They did seem to be keeping their oath. How could they not? They were Aes Sedai. A fine thing if he took an assassin's blade while one of the sisters tried to decide whether serving meant saving him or obeying meant not channeling. "Why are you laughing?" Min wanted to know. Sayera pranced closer, and she smiled up at him. "This is no laughing matter, my Lord Dragon," Marana said acidly on the other side. "The Athan Mier can be very particular. Any people grow fastidious when it comes to their prophecies." "The world is a laughing matter," he told her. Min laughed along with him, but Marana sniffed and went right back to the sea folk as soon as he stopped. At the river, the high city walls ran out into the water, flanking long gray stone docks that stretched out from the quay. River ships and boats and barges of every kind and size were tied everywhere, the crews on deck to see the commotion, but the vessel Rand sought stood ready and waiting, lashed end-on to the end of a dock where all the laborers had already been cleared off. A longboat, it was called, a low, narrow splinter without any masts, just one staff in the bow, 4 paces tall, topped by a lantern, and another at the stern. Nearly 30 paces in length and lined with as many long oars, it could not carry the cargo a sailing vessel the same size would, but it had no need of the wind either, and with a shallow draft, it could travel day and night, using rowers in shifts. Longboats ran the rivers with cargoes of importance and urgency. It had seemed appropriate. The captain bowed repeatedly as Rand came down the boarding ramp with Min on his arm and the Aes Sedai and Ashaman at his heels. Elva Shayna was even skinnier than his craft, in a yellow coat of Mirandian cut that hung to his knees. "It's an honor to be carrying you, my Lord Dragon," he murmured, mopping his bald head with a large handkerchief. "An honor it is. An honor indeed. An honor." Plainly the man would rather have had his ship brimful of live vipers. He blinked at the Aes Sedai's shawls and stared at their ageless faces and licked his lips, eyes flickering back to Rand uneasily. The Ashaman dropped his mouth open once he put their black coats together with rumor, and thereafter he avoided so much as a glance in their direction. Shayna watched Dobrain lead the men with the banners aboard, and the trumpeters and the drummers lugging their drums, then eyed the horsemen lining the dock as if he suspected they might want to board too. Nandera with 20 maidens and Kamar with 20 black eyes, all with shufa wrapped around their heads, though unveiled, made the captain step hastily to put the Aes Sedai between him and them. The Aiel wore scowls for the heartbeat that needing to veil might slow them, but the sea folk might well know what a veil meant, and it would hardly do for them to think they were under attack. Rand thought Shayna's handkerchief might yet rub away what thin gray fringe of hair he had left. The longboat swept away from the dock on its long oars, the two banners rippling in the bows, and the drums pounding and the trumpets blaring. Out in the river, people appeared on the decks of ships to watch, even climbed into the rigging. On the sea folk ship, they came out too, many in bright colors, unlike the drab clothing on crews of the other vessels. The White Spray was a larger craft than most of the rest, yet somehow sleeker as well, with two large masts raked back sharply, and spars laid across them squarely, where nearly all the other ships had slanting spars, longer than the masts, to hold most of their sails. Everything about it spoke of difference, but in one thing Rand knew, the Athan Mier had to be like everyone else. They could either agree to follow him on their own, or be forced to it. The prophecies said he would bind together the people of every land. The north shall he tie to the east, and the west shall be bound to the south, it said. And no one could be allowed to stand aside. He knew that now. Sending out orders from his bath, he had not had an opportunity to give details of what he intended on reaching White Spray, so he announced them now. The details produced grins among the Ashaman, as expected. Well, Finn and Arishma grinned, Deshiva blinked absently, and frowns among the Aiel, also as expected. They did not like being left behind. Dobrain merely nodded. He knew he was only here for show today. What Rand did not expect was the Aiel reaction. "It shall be as you command, my Lord Dragon," Marana said, making one of those small curtsies. The other four exchanged glances, but they were curtsying and murmuring "as you command" right behind her. Not one protest, not one frown, not a single haughty stare or recital of why it should be done any way but what he wanted. Could he begin to trust them? Or would they find some Aes Sedai way to wriggle around their oath as soon as his back was turned? "They will keep their word," Min murmured abruptly, just as if she had read his thoughts. With an arm wrapped around his and both hands holding his sleeve, she kept her voice for his ears alone. "I just saw these 5 in your hand," she added in case he did not understand. He was not sure he could fix his mind around that, even if she had seen it in a viewing. He did not have long to try. The longboat flew through the water, and in no time at all was backing oars some 20 paces from the much taller White Spray. Drums and trumpets fell silent, and Rand channeled, making a bridge of air laced with fire that connected the longboat's railing to that of the sea folk ship. With Min on his arm, he started to cross, to every eye but that of an Ashaman, upward on nothing. He half expected men to falter, at least at first, but he simply walked at his side, as though there were stone beneath his little boots. "I trust you," she said quietly. She smiled, too. Partly a confident smile, and partly he thought because she was amused at reading his mind once more. He wondered how much she would trust if she knew that this was as far as he could weave a bridge like this. One pace farther, 1 foot, and the whole thing would have given way at the first step. At that point, it became like trying to lift yourself with the power, an impossibility. Even the Forsaken did not know why, any more than they knew why a woman could make a longer bridge than a man, even if she was not as strong. It was not a matter of weight. Any amount of weight could cross any bridge. Just short of White Spray's railing, he stopped, standing in midair. For all Marana's descriptions, the people staring back at him were a shock. Dark women and bare-chested men with colorful slashes that dangled to the knee, and gold or silver chains around their necks and rings in their ears, in their noses of all places on some of the women, who wore a rainbow of blouses above their dark, baggy breeches. None had any more expression than an Aes Sedai who was trying hard. 4 of the women, despite being barefoot like the rest, wore bright silks. 2 of them were kittens, and they had more necklaces and earrings than anyone else as well, with a chain strung with gold medallions running from an earring to a ring in the side of the nose. They said nothing, only stood together watching him, sniffing at small lacy golden boxes that hung from chains around their necks. He addressed himself to them. "I am the Dragon Reborn. I am the Koramur." A collective sigh ran through the crew, not among the 4 women, though. "I am Areen Din Togara Two Winds, Wave Mistress to Clan Shodain," announced the one with the most earrings, a handsome, full-mouthed woman in red brocade, wearing 5 fat little gold rings in each ear. There were white streaks through her straight black hair, and fine lines at the corners of her eyes. She had an impressive dignity. "I speak here for the mistress of the ships. If it pleases the light, the Koramur may come aboard." For some reason, she gave a start, and so did the 3 with her, but that sounded entirely too much like permission. Rand stepped onto the deck with men wishing he had not waited. He let the bridge go, and Saidin, but immediately felt another bridge replace it. In short order, the Ashaman and the Aes Sedai were with him, the sisters no more flustered than Min had been, though perhaps 1 or 2 did straighten their skirts a bit more than necessary. They were still not so easy around the Ashaman as they pretended. The 4 Seafolk women took one look at the Aes Sedai and immediately gathered in a close huddle, whispering. Areen did a lot of the talking, and so did a young pretty woman in green brocade with 8 earrings altogether, but the pair in plain silk put in occasional comments. Marana coughed delicately and spoke softly into the hand she used to cover it. "I heard her name you the Koramur. The Apa'an Mier are great bargainers, I've heard, but I think she gave away something then." Nodding, Rand glanced down at Min. She was squinting at the Seafolk women, but as soon as she noticed his look, she shook her head ruefully. She saw nothing else that might help her. Areen turned so calmly, there might never have been any hasty conference. "This is Shallan Din Togara Morningtide, Windfinder to Clan Shodain," she said with a small bow toward the woman in green brocade. "And this is Dera Din Salan Rising Wave, Sail Mistress of White Spray." Each woman bowed slightly as she was named, and touched fingers to her lips. Dara, a handsome woman a little short of her middle years, wore plain blue and also 8 earrings, though her earrings, nose ring, and the chain that ran between was finer than Hareen's or Shallan's. "The welcome of my ship to you," Dara said, "and the grace of the light be upon you until you leave his decks." She made a small bow toward the 4th woman in yellow. "This is Tavel Din Chennai Nine Gulls, Windfinder of White Spray." Only 3 rings hung from each of Tavel's ears, fine like those of the sailmistress. She looked younger than Shallan, no older than himself. Areen took it up again, gesturing toward the raised stern of the ship. "We will speak in my cabin if it pleases you. A Soarer is not a large vessel, Randall Thor, and the cabin is small. If it pleases you to come alone, all here stand surety for your safety." So, from the Coramor to plain Randall Thor, she would take back what she had given if she could. He was about to open his mouth and agree, anything to get this done. Irene was already moving that way, still gesturing for him to follow, the other women with her, when Mirana gave another tiny cough. "The Windfinders can channel," she murmured hastily into her hand. "You should take 2 sisters with you, or they'll feel they've gained the upper hand." Rand frowned. The upper hand? He was the Dragon Reborn, after all. Still... "I will be pleased to come, Wave Mistress, but Min here goes everywhere with me." He patted Min's hand on his arm. She had not let go an instant, and Hareen nodded. Topple was already holding the door open. Dara made one of those small bows, gesturing him toward it. "And Dashiva, of course." The man gave a start at his name, as if he had been asleep. At least he was not staring wide-eyed around the deck like Flynn and Narishma. Staring at the women. Stories spoke of the alluring beauty and grace of seafolk women, and Rand could certainly see that. They walked as if they would begin dancing on the next step, swaying sinuously. But he had not brought the men here to ogle. "Keep your eyes open," he told them harshly. Narishma colored, jerking himself stiffly erect, and pressed fist to chest. Flynn simply saluted, but both seemed more alert. For some reason, Min looked up at him with the tiniest wry smile. Hareen nodded a little more impatiently. A man stepped out from the crew in baggy green silk breeches, and with an ivory-hilted sword and dagger thrust behind his sash. More white-haired than she, he also wore 5 fat little rings in each ear. She waved him away even more impatiently. "As it please you, Randall Thor," she said. "And of course," Rand added, as though an afterthought, "I must have Mirana and Raphella." He was not certain why he chose the second name. Perhaps because the plump Tyrant sister was the only one not green, except Mirana. But to his surprise, Mirana smiled in approval. For that matter, Bera nodded, and so did Phaedron and Alana. Irene did not approve. Her mouth tightened before she could control it. "As it pleases you," she said, not quite so pleasantly as before. Once he was inside the stern cabin, where everything except a few brass-bound chests seemed built into the walls, Rand was not so sure the woman had not gained whatever she wanted just bringing him there. For one thing, he was forced to stand hunched over, even between the roof beams, whatever they were called on a ship. He had read several books about ships, but none mentioned that. The chair he was offered at the foot of the narrow table would not pull out, being fastened to the deck, and once Min showed him how to unlatch the chair arm and swing it out so he could sit, his knees hit the bottom of the table. There were only 8 chairs. Irene sat at the far end, her back to the stern's red-shuttered windows, with her windfinder to her left, and the sailmistress to her right, and Topple below her. Mirana and Raphella took the chairs below Shallan, while Min sat to Rand's left. Dashiva, with no chair, took a place beside the door, standing upright quite easily, though the roof beams almost brushed his head, too. A young woman in a bright blue blouse, with one thin earring in each ear, brought thick cups of tea, brewed black and bitter. "Let's be done with this," Rand said testily as soon as the woman left with her tray. He left his cup on the table after one sip. He could not stretch out his legs. He hated being confined. Thoughts of being doubled inside the chest flashed in his head, and it was all he could do to rein his temper. "The stone of Tyr has fallen. The Aiel have come over the dragon wall. All the parts of your Jendai prophecy have come to pass. I am the Coramor." Irene smiled across her cup, a cool smile with no amusement in it. "That may be so, as it pleases the light, but..." "It is so," Rand snapped, despite a warning glance from Mirana. She went so far as to nudge his leg with her foot. He ignored that, too. The cabin walls seemed closer somehow. "What is it that you don't believe, Wave Mistress? That Aes Sedai serve me?" "Rafella, Mirana," he gestured sharply. All he wanted was for them to come to him and be seen to come, but they set down their cups and rose gracefully, glided to either side of him, and knelt. Each took one of his hands in both of hers and pressed her lips to the back of it, right on the shining golden-maned head of the dragon that wound around his forearm. He just managed to conceal his shock, not taking his eyes from Hareen. Her face went a little gray. "Aes Sedai serve me, and so will the sea folk." He motioned the sisters back to their seats. Oddly, they looked a touch surprised. "That is what the Jedi prophecy says. The sea folk will serve the Koramur. I am the Koramur." "Yes, but there is the matter of the bargain." That word was plainly capitalized in Hareen's tone. "The Jedi prophecy says you will bring us to glory, and all the seas of the world will be ours. As we give to you, you must give to us. If I do not make the bargain well, Nesta will hang me naked in the rigging by my ankles and call the first 12 of Clan Shodine to name a new Wave Mistress." A look of utter horror stole across her face as those words came out of her mouth, and her black eyes went wider and wider by the word with disbelief. Her wavefinder goggled at her, and Dara and Tavel tried so hard not to, their eyes fastened to the table, that it seemed their faces might break. And suddenly Rand understood. ta'veren. He had seen the effects, the sudden moments when the least likely thing happened because he was near, but he had never known what was going on before until it was finished. Easing his legs as best he could, he leaned his arms on the table. "The Athaan Mier will serve me, Hareen. That is given." "Yes, we will serve you, but..." Hareen half reared out her chair, spilling her tea. "What are you doing to me, Aes Sedai?" she cried, trembling. "This is not fair bargaining." "We do nothing," Mirana said calmly. She actually managed to drink a swallow of that tea without wincing. "You are in the presence of the dragon reborn," Rafella added. "The Koramur your prophecy calls you to serve, as I believe." She laid a finger to one round cheek. "You said you speak for the mistress of the ships. Does that mean your word is binding on the Athaan Mier?" "Yes," Hareen whispered hoarsely, falling back in her seat. "What I say binds every ship and all to the mistress of the ships herself." It was impossible for one of the sea folk to go white in the face, yet staring at Rand, she came as near as she could. He smiled at Min to share the moment. At last a people would come to him without fighting every step of the way, or splitting apart like the Aiel. Maybe Min thought he wanted her to help clinch matters, or maybe it was ta'veren. She leaned toward the Wave Mistress. "You will be punished for what happens here today, Hareen, but not so much as you fear, I think. At least, one day you will be the mistress of the ships." Hareen frowned at her, then glanced to her windfinder. "She is not Aes Sedai," Shallan said, and Hareen seemed caught between relief and disappointment, until Rafella spoke. "Several years ago, I heard reports of a girl with a remarkable ability to see things. Are you she, Min?" Min grimaced into her cup, then nodded reluctantly. She always said that the more people knew what she could do, the less good came of it. Glancing across the table at the Aes Sedai, she sighed. Rafella only nodded, but Mirana was staring at her, hazel eyes avid in a mask of serenity. No doubt she expected to corner Min as soon as possible and find out what this talent was and how it worked, and no doubt Min expected it too. Rand felt a prickle of irritation. She should have known he would protect her from being bothered. A prickle of irritation, and a warmth that he could protect her from that, at least. "You may trust what Min says, Hareen," Rafella said. "The reports I heard say that what she sees always seems to come true. And even if she does not realize it, she has seen something else." Her round face tilted to one side, and a smile curved her mouth. If you will be punished for what happens here, then it must mean you will agree to whatever your Koramur wants. Unless I agree to nothing, Irene blustered. If I make no bargain... Her fists clenched on the tabletop. She had already admitted she had to make the bargain. She had admitted the sea folk would serve. What I require of you is not onerous, Rand said. He had thought about this since deciding to come. When I want ships to carry men or supplies, the sea folk will give them. I want to know what is happening in Taraban and Arad-Daman, and in the lands between. Your ships can learn, will learn, what I want to know. They call in Tanchico and Bandar Eben, and 100 fishing villages and towns between. Your ships can travel farther out to sea than anyone else's. The sea folk will keep watch as far west in the Arath Ocean as they can sail. There is a people, the Shonchan, who live beyond the Arath Ocean, and one day they will come to try to conquer us. The sea folk will let me know when they come. You require much, Irene muttered bitterly. We know of these Shonchan, who come from the islands of the dead, it seems, from which no ship returns. Some of our ships have encountered theirs. They use the One Power as a weapon. You require more than you know, Koramur. For once, she did not pause at the title. Some dark evil has descended upon the Arath Ocean. No ship of ours has come from there in many months. Ships that sail west vanish. Rand felt a chill. He turned the dragon scepter, made from part of a Shonchan spear, in his hands. Could they have returned already? They had been driven back once at Falma. He carried the spearhead to remind him that there were more enemies in the world than those he could see. But he had been sure it would take the Shonchan years to recover from their defeat.
Right back, everyone.
Driven into the sea by the Dragon Reborn and the dead heroes called back by the Horn of Valir. Was the horn still in the White Tower? He knew it had been taken there. Suddenly, he could not bear the confines of the cabin any longer. He fumbled with the latch on the chair arm. It would not open. Gripping the smooth wood, he tore the arm off in splinters with one convulsive heave. We've agreed the sea folk will serve me, he said, pushing himself up. The low ceiling made him hunch over the table threateningly. The cabin did feel smaller. If there is any more to your bargain, Mirana and Rafaela here will see to it with you. Without waiting for an answer, he spun for the door, where Deshiva appeared to be muttering to himself again. Mirana caught him there, caught his sleeve, and spoke swiftly and low. My Lord Dragon, it would be for the best if you remained. You have seen what your being Taviran has done already. With you here, I believe she will continue to reveal what she wants to hide and give agreement before we give anything. You are Grey Aja, he told her harshly. Negotiate! Deshiva, come with me. On deck, he drew deep breaths. The cloudless sky was open overhead. Open. It took him a moment to notice Bera and the other two sisters watching him expectantly. Flynn and Narishma kept to what they were supposed to do, a quarter of an eye on the ship, and the rest on the riverbanks, the city on one side, and the half-rebuilt granaries on the other. A ship in mid-river was a vulnerable place to be if one of the Forsaken decided to strike. For that matter, anywhere was a dangerous place then. Rand could not understand why one of them had not at least tried to destroy the Sun Palace around his ears. Min took his arm, and he gave a start. I'm sorry, he said. I shouldn't have left you. That's all right, she laughed. Mirana is already setting to work. I think she means to get you Hareen's best blouse, and maybe her second best as well. The Wave Mistress looks like a rabbit caught between two ferrets. Rand nodded. The sea folk were his, or as good as. What matter whether the Horn of Valir was in the White Tower? He was Taviran. He was the Dragon Reborn in the Koramur. The golden sun still burned well short of its noon peak. The day is young yet, Min. He could do anything. Would you like to see me settle the rebels? 1,000 crowns to a kiss, they're mine before sunset.
Chapter 35. Into the Woods. Sitting cross-legged on Rand's bed, Min watched him in his shirt sleeves rooting through the coats in the huge ivory-inlaid wardrobe. How could he sleep in this room with all its black, heavy furniture? A part of her thought absently about moving everything out, replacing it with some carved pieces she had seen in Camelin, lightly touched with gilding, and pale draperies and linens that he would find less oppressive. Odd. She had never cared one way or another about furniture or linens. But that one tapestry of a battle, of a lone swordsman surrounded by enemies and about to be overwhelmed, that definitely had to go. Mostly, though, she just watched him. There was such an intent look in his morning blue eyes, and the snowy shirt tightened across the broad of his back when he turned to reach deep into the wardrobe's interior. He had very good legs and marvelous calves, shown off well in dark, close-fitting breeches, with his boots turned down. Sometimes he frowned, combing fingers through dark reddish hair. No amount of brushing could make it ruly. It always curled slightly around his ears and on the nape of his neck. She was not one of those fool women who toss their brains at a man's feet along with their hearts. It was just that sometimes near him, thinking clearly became a trifle difficult. That was all. Coat after embroidered silk coat came out and was tossed to the floor, atop the one he had worn to the Seafolk ship. Could the negotiations still be going half so well without his Taviran presence? If only she had a really useful viewing of the Seafolk. As always, to her eyes, images and colorful auras flickered around him, most gone too quickly to make out, all but one meaningless to her at the moment. That one viewing came and went 100 times a day, and whenever Matt or Perrin were present, it encompassed them too, and sometimes others. A vast shadow lurked over him, swallowing up thousands upon thousands of tiny lights like fireflies that hurled themselves into it in an attempt to fill up the darkness. Today there seemed to be countless tens of thousands of fireflies, but the shadow seemed larger too. Somehow that viewing represented his battle with the shadow, but he almost never wanted to know how it stood. Not that he could really say, except that the shadow always seemed to be winning to one degree or another. She sighed with relief to see the image go. A tiny thrill of guilt made her shift her seat on the coverlet. She had not really lied when he asked what viewings she had kept back. Not really. What good to tell him he would almost certainly fail without a woman who was dead and gone? He became bleak too easily as it was. She had to keep his spirits up, make him remember to laugh. Except, I don't think this is a good idea, Rand. Saying that might be a mistake. Men were strange creatures in so many ways. One minute they took reasonable advice, and the next did just the opposite. Deliberately did the opposite, it seemed. For some reason, though, she felt protective toward this towering man who could probably lift her with either hand. And that without his channeling.
What the fuck?
It is a wonderful idea, he said, tossing down a blue coat with silver embroidery. I'm Taviran, and today it seems to be working in my favor for a change. A green coat with gold embroidery went to the floor. Wouldn't you rather comfort me again?
That one.
He stopped dead, staring at her with a silver-worked red coat hanging forgotten in his hands.
That's crazy.
She hoped she was not
I
blushing.
was higher,
Comforting.
overall.
Where did that idea ever come from? She wondered silently. The aunts who had raised her were gentle, kind women, but they had strong notions of proper behavior.
Shadow Legends.
They had disapproved of her wearing breeches, disapproved of her working in stables, the job she loved best, since it brought her into contact with horses. There was no question what they would think of comforting with a man she was not married to. If they ever found out, they would ride all the way from Bearlawn just to skin her. And him too, of course. I need to keep moving while I'm sure it is still working, he said slowly, then turned quite quickly back to the wardrobe. This will do, he exclaimed, putting on the same coat of green wool. I didn't know this was in there. It was the coat he had worn coming back from Dumai's Wells, and she could see his hands tremble as he remembered. Trying to be casual, she got up and went to put her arms around him, crushing the coat between them as she laid her head against his chest. "I love you," was all she said. Through his shirt, she could feel the round, half-healed scar on his left side. She could recall when he got it as if it were yesterday. That had been the first time she ever held him in her arms, while he lay unconscious and near death. His hands pressed against her back, squeezing her tight, squeezing the breath out of her, but then, disappointingly, they fell away. She thought he muttered something about "not fair" under his breath. Was he thinking about the sea folk while she hugged him? He should be, really. Marana was a gray, yet it was said the sea folk could make a Domani sweat. He should be, but she thought about kicking his ankle. Gently,
Cheers,
he moved
Chris.
her away and began pulling on the coat.
Just playing a game.
She said firmly. You can't be sure it will have any effect,
Raid
just because
Shadow
it did on
Legends.
Hareen. If you being
It's one you
Taviran
can get
always
on your
affected
tablet,
everything,
your
you'd have every
computer,
ruler
your
kneeling at your
phone.
feet by now, and the white cloaks too.
It's a pretty cool one.
I'm the
Could you get
dragon
pretty
reborn,
cool
he replied haughtily.
creatures
And today
or
I can do anything.
fighters, I guess you could say.
Scooping up his sword belt, he fastened it around his waist. It bore a plain brass buckle now. The gilded dragon lay atop the coverlet on the bed. Gloves of thin black leather went on to cover the gold-maned heads on the backs of his hands, and the herons branded on his palms.
Oh.
But I don't look like him, do I? He spread his arms, smiling. They won't know until it's too late. She almost threw up her hands. You don't look much like a fool either. And let him take that how he would. The idiot eyed her askance, as if he was not sure. Rand, as soon as they see the Aiel, they will either run or start fighting. If you won't take any of the Aes Sedai, at least take those Ashaman. One arrow and you're dead, whether you're the dragon reborn or a goat herd. But I am the dragon reborn, Min, he said seriously. And Taviran. We are going alone. Just you and me. That is, if you still want to come. You're not going anywhere without me, Rand al'Thor. She stopped herself from saying he would trip over his own feet if he did. This euphoria was almost as bad as the dark bleakness. Nandera won't like this. She did not know exactly what went on between him and the maidens. Something very peculiar indeed by the things she had seen, but any hope that that might stop him guttered out when he grinned like a small boy evading his mother. She won't know, Min. He even had a twinkle in his eye. I do this all the time, and they never know. He held out a gloved hand, expecting her to jump when he called. There really was nothing to do but straighten her green coat, glance into the stand mirror to make sure of her hair, and take his hand. The trouble was, she was ready to leap if he crooked a finger. She just wanted to make sure he never found out. In the anteroom, he made a gateway atop the golden rising sun set in the floor, and she let him lead her through onto a hilly forest floor carpeted with dead leaves. A bird flashed away, flaring red wings. A squirrel appeared on a branch and chittered at them, lashing a furry white-tipped tail.
Windy
It was
out
hardly
there.
the sort of woods she remembered from near Bear Lawn. There were not many real forests anywhere close to the city of Cairhien. Most of the trees stood 4 or 5 or even 10 paces apart. Tall leather leaves and pines, taller oaks, and trees she did not know, running across the flat she and Rand stood on, and up a slope that began only a few spans off. Even the undergrowth seemed thinner than back home. The bushes and vines and briars spread out in patches, though some of those were not small. Everything was brown and dry. She plucked the lace-edged handkerchief from her sleeve and dabbed at the sweat that suddenly seemed to pop out on her face. "Which way do we go?" she asked. By the sun, north lay over the slope, the direction she would choose. The city should lie about 7 or 8 miles in that direction. With luck, they could walk all the way back without encountering anyone. Or better, given her heeled boots and the terrain, not to mention the heat, Rand could decide to give up and make another gateway back to the Sun Palace. The palace rooms were cool compared to this. Before he could answer, crackling brush and leaves announced someone coming. The rider who appeared on a long-legged gray gelding with bright-fringed bridle and reins was a Kyrianan woman, short and slender in a dark blue, nearly black silk riding dress, horizontal slashes of red and green and white running from her neck to below her knees. The sweat on her face could not diminish her pale beauty or make her eyes less than large, dark pools. A small, clear green stone hung on her forehead from a fine golden chain, fastened in black hair that fell in waves to her shoulders. Min gasped, and not for the hunting crossbow the woman carried, casually raised in one green-gloved hand. For a moment she was sure it was Moiraine. But I do not recall seeing either of you in the camp, the woman said in a throaty, almost sultry voice. Moiraine's voice had been crystal. The crossbow lowered, still quite casually, until it pointed rock-steady at Rand's chest. He ignored it. "I thought I might like to take a look at your camp," he said with a slight bow. "I believe you are the Lady Caroline Damodred?" The slender woman inclined her head, acknowledging the name. Min sighed regretfully, but it was not as if she had really expected Moiraine to turn up alive. Moiraine was the only viewing of hers that had ever failed. But Caroline Damodred herself, one of the leaders of the rebellion against Rand here in Cairhien and a claimant to the Sun Throne, he really was pulling all the threads of the pattern around him to have her appear. Lady Caroline slowly raised the crossbow to one side. The cord made a loud snap, launching the broadhead bolt into the air. "I doubt one would do any good against you," she said, walking her gelding slowly toward them. "And I would not like you to think I was threatening you." She looked once at Min, just a glance that ran head to toe, though Min was sure everything about her was filed away. But aside from that, Lady Caroline kept her eyes on Rand. She drew rein 3 paces away, just far enough so he could not reach her a foot before she could dig in her heels. "I can only think of one gray-eyed man with your height who might suddenly appear out of nowhere, unless perhaps you are an Aiel in disguise. But perhaps you will be so kind as to supply a name." "I am the Dragon Reborn," Rand said, every bit as arrogant as he had been with the sea folk. Yet if any Taviran swirling of the pattern was at work, the woman on the horse gave no evidence. Rather than leaping down to fall to her knees, she merely nodded, pursing her lips. "I have heard so very much about you. I have heard you went to the tower to submit to the Amelin seat. I have heard you mean to give the Sun Throne to Elaine Trakand. I've also heard that you killed Elaine and her mother." "I submit to no one," Rand replied sharply. He stared up at her with eyes fierce enough to snatch her out of the saddle by themselves. "Elaine is on her way to Caemlyn as we speak, to take the throne of Andor, after which she will have the throne of Cairhien as well." Min winced. Did he have to sound like a pillow stuffed full of haughty? She had hoped he had calmed down a bit after the sea folk. Lady Caroline laid her crossbow across the saddle in front of her, running a gloved hand along it, perhaps regretting that loosed bolt. "I could accept my young son on the throne. Better she than some, at least. But..." Those big dark eyes that had seemed so liquid suddenly became stone. "But I am not sure I can accept you in Cairhien. And I do not mean only your changes to laws and customs. You change fate by your very presence. Every day since you came, people die in accidents so bizarre no one can believe them. So many husbands abandon their wives and wives their husbands that no one even comments upon it now. You will tear Cairhien apart just by remaining here." "Balance," Min broke in hastily. Rand's face was so dark he looked ready to burst. Maybe he had been right to come after all. Certainly there was no point letting him throw this meeting away in a tantrum. She gave no one a chance to speak. There is always a balance of good against bad. That's how the pattern works. Even he doesn't change that. As night balances day, good balances harm. Since he came, there hasn't been a single stillbirth in the city, not one child born deformed. There are more marriages some days than used to be in a week, and for every man who chokes to death on a feather, a woman tumbles head over heels down 3 flights of stairs, and instead of breaking her neck, stands up without a bruise. Name the evil and you can point to the good. The turning of the wheel requires balance, and he only increases the chances of what might have happened anyway in nature. Suddenly she colored, realizing they were both looking at her, staring more like. Balance, Rand murmured, eyebrows lifting. I've been reading some of Master Fell's books, she said faintly. She did not want anyone to think she was pretending to be a philosopher. Lady Caroline smiled at her tall saddle bow and toyed with her reins.
No, that was nasty.
The woman was laughing at her. She would show this woman what she could laugh at. Abruptly, a tall black gelding with the look of a war horse came crashing through the undergrowth, ridden by a man well into his middle years, with close-cropped hair and a pointed beard. Despite his yellow Tyran coat, the fat sleeves striped with green satin, eyes of a startling pretty blue looked out of his damp, dark face like pale, polished sapphires. Not a particularly pretty man, but those eyes made up for a too long nose. He carried a crossbow in one leather gauntleted hand and brandished a broadhead bolt in the other. This came down inches from my face, Caroline, and it has your markings. Just because there's no game is no reason. He became aware of Rand and Min just then, and his drawn crossbow lowered toward them. Are these strays, Caroline? Or did you find spies from the city? I've never believed Al Thor would continue to let us sit here unhindered. Half a dozen more riders appeared behind him, sweating men in fat-sleeved coats with satin stripes, and perspiring women in riding dresses with wide, thick lace collars, all carrying crossbows. The last of those riders had not halted, horses stamping and tossing heads, before twice as many came struggling through the brush from another direction and pulled up near Caroline. Slight, pale men and women in dark clothes with stripes of color, sometimes to below the waist, all with crossbows. Servants afoot came after, laboring and panting with the heat, the men who would dress and carry any downed game. It hardly seemed to matter that none had more than a skinning knife at his belt. Min swallowed, and unconsciously began patting her cheeks with her handkerchief a little more vigorously. If even one person recognized Rand before he knew it. Lady Caroline did not hesitate. Not spies, darling, she said, turning her horse to face the Tyran newcomers. The High Lord Darlin Cisnera. All that was needed now was Lord Toram Riotin. Min wished Rand's Taviran tugging at the pattern could be just a little less complete. A cousin and his wife, Caroline went on, come from Andor to see me. May I present Thomas Trakand, from a minor branch of the house, and his wife, Jaisi. Min almost glared at her. The only Jaisi she had ever known had been lingered a moment on Min. He lowered his crossbow and bowed his head just a hair, a high lord of Tyr to a minor noble. You are welcome, Lord Tomas. It takes a brave man to join us in our present circumstances. Al Thor may loose the savages on us any day. The Lady Caroline gave him an exasperated look that he made a show of not seeing. He noted that Rand's return bow was no more than his, however. Noted and frowned. A darkly handsome woman in his retinue muttered angrily under her breath. She had a long, hard face, well practiced in anger, and a stout fellow, scowling and sweating in a red-striped coat of pale green, heeled his horse forward a few steps as if thinking to ride Rand down. The wheel weaves as the wheel wills, Rand said coolly, as though he noticed nothing. The dragon reborn to just about anybody was what it was. Arrogance on a mountaintop. Not much happens as we expect. For instance, I heard you were in Tyr. in Haddon Merk. Min wished she dared speak up, dared say something to soothe him. She settled for stroking his arm, casually. A wife. Now there was a word that suddenly sounded fine. A wife idly patting her husband. Another fine word. Light, it was hard being fair. It was hardly fair having to be fair. The High Lord Darlin has but lately come by longboat with a few of his close friends, Thomas. Caroline's throaty tone never changed, but her gelding suddenly pranced, no doubt at a sharp heel, and under cover of regaining control, she turned her back to Darlin and shot Rand a brief warning frown. Do not trouble the High Lord, Thomas. I do not mind, Caroline, Darlin said, slinging his crossbow from his saddle by a loop. He rode a little closer and rested an arm on his tall saddle bow. A man should know what he is stepping into. You may have heard the tales about Althor going to the tower, Thomas. I came because Aes Sedai approached me months ago with suggestions that might happen, and your cousin informed me she had received the same. We thought we might put her on the Sun Throne before Colaver could take it. Well, Althor is no fool. Never believe he is. Myself, I think he played the tower like a harp. Colaver is hanged. He sits secure behind Cyrion's walls, without an Aes Sedai halter, I'll wager, no matter what rumor says. And until we find some way to extricate ourselves, we sit in his hand, waiting for him to make a fist. A ship brought you, Rand said simply. A ship could take you away. Abruptly, Min realized he was gently patting her hand on his arm, trying to soothe her. Startlingly, Darlin threw back his head and laughed. A great many women would forget his nose for those eyes and that laugh. So it would, Thomas. But I've asked your cousin to marry me. She will not say yes or no, but a man cannot abandon even a possible wife to the mercies of the Aiel, and she will not leave. Caroline Damodred drew herself up on her saddle, face cold enough to shame an Aes Sedai, but suddenly auras of red and white flashed around her and Darlin, and Min knew. The colors never seemed to matter, but she knew that they would marry, after Caroline had led him a merry chase. More, to her eyes, a crown suddenly appeared on Darlin's head, a simple golden circlet with a slightly curved sword lying on its side above his brows. The king's crown he would wear one day, though of what country she could not say. Tyr had high lords instead of a king. Image and auras vanished as Darlin pulled his horse around to face Caroline. There's no game to be found today. Toram has already returned to camp. I suggest we do the same. Those blue eyes scanned the surrounding trees quickly. It seems your cousin and his wife have lost their horses. They will wander in a careless moment, he added to Rand in a kindly tone. He knew very well they had no horses. But I'm sure Rover and Inez will give up their mounts. A walk in the air will do them good. The stout man in the red-striped coat swung down from his tall bay immediately, with a toadying smile for Darlin, and one markedly less warm, if just as greasy, for Rand. The angry-faced woman was a moment later in climbing stiffly from her silver-gray mare. She did not look pleased. Neither was Min. You mean to go into their camp? She whispered as Rand led her to the horses. Are you mad? She added before thinking. Not yet, he said softly, touching her nose with the tip of one finger. Thanks to you, I know that. And he boosted her onto the mare, then climbed into the bay's saddle and heeled the animal up beside Darlin. Heading north and a little toward the west across the slope, they left Rover and Inez standing beneath the trees, frowning at one another sourly. As they fell in behind with the Kyrianan, the other Tyrans shouted laughing wishes that the pair would enjoy the walk. Min would have ridden alongside Rand, but Caroline put a hand on her arm, drawing her in back of the two men. I want to see what he does, Caroline said quietly. Which one, Min wondered. You are his lover? Caroline asked. Yes, Min told her defiantly, once she could catch a breath. Her cheeks felt like fire. But the woman only nodded, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Maybe it was in Kyrian. Sometimes she realized that all the sophistication she had picked up talking to worldly people was about as thick as her blouse. Rand and Darlin rode knee to knee just ahead, the younger man half a head taller than the older, each wrapped in pride like a cloak, but talking just the same. Listening was not easy. They spoke quietly, and the dead leaves rustling under the horses' hooves, fallen branches cracking, often was enough to muffle their words. The cry of a hawk overhead or the chattering of a squirrel in a tree drowned them. Still, it was possible to overhear snatches. "If I may say so, Tomas," Darlin said at one point as they headed down after the first rise, "and under the light I offer no disrespect, you are fortunate in having a beautiful wife. The light willing, I will have one as beautiful myself." "Why do they not speak of something important?" Caroline muttered. Min turned her head to hide a small smile. The Lady Caroline did not look half as displeased as she sounded. She herself had never cared whether anyone thought her pretty or not. Well, until she met Rand, anyway. Maybe Darlin's nose was not all that long. "I would have let him take Callandor from the stone," Darlin said some time later as they climbed a sparsely treed slope. "But I could not stand aside when he brought Aiel invaders into Tyr." "I've read the prophecies of the dragon," Rand said, leaning forward on the bay's neck and urging the animal on. A fine, glossy appearance the horse had, but no more bottom than his owner, Min suspected. "The stone had to fall before he could take Callandor," Rand continued. "Other Tyran lords follow him, so I hear." Darlin snorted. "They cringe and lick his boots. I could have followed if that was what he wanted. If..." With a sigh, he shook his head. "Too many ifs, Tomas. There is a saying in Tyr. Any quarrel can be forgiven, but kings never forget. Tyr has not been under a king since Arthur Hawkwing, but I think the Dragon Reborn is very like a king. No, he has attainted me with treason, as he calls it, and I must go on as I began. The light willing, I may see Tyr sovereign on its own land once more before I die." It had to be Taviran work, Min knew. The man would never have spoken this way to someone casually met, Caroline Damodred's supposed cousin or not. But what did Rand think? She could hardly wait to tell him about the crown. Topping that hill, they suddenly came on a knot of spearmen, some with a dented breastplate or helmet, most without either, who bowed as soon as they saw the party. To left and right through the trees, Min could see other groups of sentries. Below, the camp lay spread out in what seemed a permanent haze of dust, down a nearly treeless slope, and across the hill valley and up the next hill. Each of the few tents was large, with some noble's banner hanging limply on a staff above the peak. Almost as many horses stood tied to picket lines as there were people, and thousands of men and a handful of women wandered among the cook fires and wagons. None raised a cheer as their leaders rode in. Min studied them over the handkerchief she pressed to her nose against the dust, not caring whether Caroline saw what she was doing. Dispirited faces watched them pass, and grim faces, people who knew they were in a trap. Here and there a house's Khan stood stiffly above some man's head, yet most seemed to be wearing whatever they could find, bits and pieces of armor that often neither matched nor fitted very well. A good many, though, men too tall for Kyrian, wore red coats under their battered breastplates. Min eyed a nearly obscured white lion worked on a filthy red sleeve. Darlin could only have brought a few people with him on a longboat, perhaps no more than his hunting party. Caroline looked to neither side as they rode through the camp, but whenever they came near those men in red coats, her mouth tightened. Darlin dismounted before a tremendous tent, the largest Min had ever seen, larger than any she had ever imagined, a great red-striped oval, shining in the sunlight like silk, with no fewer than 4 high conical peaks, each with the rising sun of Kyrian stirring above in a lazy breeze, gold on blue. The strumming of harps drifted out amid the murmur of voices like the sounds of geese. As servants took away the horses, Darlin offered his arm to Caroline. After a very long pause, she laid her fingers lightly on his wrist with no expression whatsoever, letting him escort her inside. "My lady wife," Rand murmured with a smile, extending his arm. Min sniffed and put her hand atop his. She would rather have hit him. He had no right to make a joke of that. He had no right to bring her here, ta'veren or no ta'veren. He could be killed here, burn him. But did he care if she spent the rest of her life weeping? She touched one of the striped door flaps as they went in and shook her head in wonder. It was silk. A silk tent. No sooner were they inside than she felt Rand stiffen. Darlin's shrunken retinue and Caroline's jostled around them with insincere murmurs of apology. Between the four main tent poles, long trestle tables groaning with food and drink stood about the colorful carpets that had been laid for a floor, and there were people everywhere. Kyrian and nobles in their finery, a few soldiers with the fronts of the heads shaved and powdered, plainly men of high rank by the fine cut of their coats. A handful of bards strolled playing through the crowd, picked out as much by a loftier air than any noble, as by the carved and gilded harps they carried. Yet Min's eyes flew as if pulled to the sure source of Rand's worry. 3 Aes Sedai talking together in shawls fringed green and brown and gray. Images and colors flashed around them, but not a thing she could make sense of. A swirl in the crowd revealed another, a comfortably round-faced woman. More images, more flaring colors, but all Min needed was the red-fringed shawl looped over her plump arms. Rand tucked her hand under his arm and patted it. "Don't worry," he said softly. "Everything is going well." She would have asked him what they were doing there, but she was afraid he would tell her. Darlin and Caroline had vanished into the crowd along with their followers, yet as a bowing serving man with stripes of red, green, and white on his dark cuffs offered a tray of silver goblets to Rand and Min, she reappeared, shaking off the importunings of a hatchet-faced fellow in one of those red coats. She glared at her back as she took a goblet of punch and waved the servant away, and Min's breath caught at the aura that suddenly danced around him, bruised hues so dark they seemed nearly black. "Don't trust that man, Lady Caroline." She could not stop herself. "He will murder anyone he thinks is in his way. He'll kill for a whim. Kill anybody." She clamped her teeth shut before saying more. Caroline glanced over her shoulder as the hatchet-faced man turned away abruptly. "I could believe it easily of David Hanlon," she said wryly. "His white lions fight for gold, not Kyrian, and loot worse than the Aiel. Andor became too hot for them, it seems." That with an arch glance at Rand. "Toram has promised them a great deal of gold, I think, and estates, I know." She tilted her eyes up to Min. "Do you know the man, Jaisi?" Min could only shake her head. How to explain what she did know about Hanlon now? That his hands would be red with more rapes and murders before he died. If she had known when or who, but all she knew was that he would. Anyway, telling about a viewing never changed it. What she saw happen, no matter who she warned. Sometimes, before she had learned better, it had happened because she warned. "I've heard of the White Lions," Rand said coldly. "Look among them for dark friends and you won't be disappointed." They had been some of Gabriel's soldiers. Min knew that much, and little more, except that Lord Gabriel had really been Ravine. It stood to reason that soldiers serving one of the Forsaken would include dark friends. "What of him?" Rand nodded toward a man across the tent whose long dark coat had as many stripes as Caroline's dress. Very tall for a Kyrianan, perhaps less than a full head shorter than Rand, he was slender except for broad shoulders, and strikingly good-looking, with a strong chin and just a touch of gray at his dark temples. For some reason, Min's eyes were drawn to his companion, a skinny little fellow with a large nose and wide ears, in a red silk coat that did not fit him very well. He kept fingering a curved dagger at his belt, a fancy piece with a golden sheath and a large red stone capping the hilt that seemed to catch the light darkly. She saw no auras around him. He seemed vaguely familiar. They were both looking at her and Rand. "That," Caroline breathed in a tight voice, "is Lord Toram Rioton himself. And his constant companion these past days, Master Jerael Mordeth. Odious little man. His eyes make me want to take a bath. They both make me feel unclean." She blinked, surprised at what she had said, but recovered quickly. Min had the feeling little put Caroline Domodred off her stride for long. In that she was very like Moiraine. "I would be careful were I you, cousin Tomas," she went on. "You may have wrought some miracle or Taviran work on me, and perhaps even on Darlin, though I cannot say what it might come to. I make no promises. But Toram hates you with a passion. It was not so bad before Mordeth joined him, yet since... Toram would have us attack the city immediately in the night. With you dead, he says, the Aiel would go, but I think it is you dead he seeks now, even more than he does the world." "Mordeth," Rand said. His eyes were locked to Toram Rioton and the skinny fellow. "His name is Padan Fain, and there are 100,000 golden crowns on his head." Caroline nearly dropped her goblet. Queens have been ransomed for less. What did he do? "He ravaged my home because it was my home." Rand's face was frozen, his voice ice. "He brought Trollocs to kill my friends because they were my friends. He is a dark friend and a dead man." Those last words came through clenched teeth. Punch splashed the carpet as the silver goblet bent in his gloved fist. Min felt sick for him, for his pain. She had heard what Fain had done in the Two Rivers, but she put a hand on Rand's chest in near panic. If he gave way now, channeled with who knew how many Aes Sedai around... "For the light's sake, take hold of yourself," she began, and a woman's voice spoke pleasantly behind her. "Will you present me to your tall young friend, Caroline?" Min looked over her shoulder, right into an ageless face, cool-eyed beneath iron-gray hair pulled up into a bun, from which dangled small golden ornaments. Swallowing a squeak, Min coughed. She had thought Caroline had taken her in one glance, but these cool eyes seemed to know things about her she herself had forgotten. The Aes Sedai's smile as she adjusted her green-fringed shawl was not nearly so pleasant as her voice. "Of course, Cadsuane Sedai." Caroline sounded shaken, but she smoothed her tone well before she finished introducing her visiting cousin and his wife. "But I fear Kyrian is no place for them at present," she said, all self-possession once more, smiling regret that she could not keep Rand and Min longer. "They have agreed to take my advice and return to Andor." "Have they?" Cadsuane said dryly. Min's heart sank. Even if Rand had not spoken of her, it was clear from the way she looked at him that she knew him. Tiny golden birds and moons and stars swayed as she shook her head. "Most boys learn not to stick their fingers into the pretty fire the first time they are burned, Thomas. Others need to be spanked to learn. Better a tender bottom than a seared hand." "You know I'm no child," Rand told her sharply. "Do I?" She eyed him from head to toe and made it seem no very great distance. "Well, it seems I shall soon see whether or not you need spanking." Those cool eyes drifted to Min, to Caroline, and with a final hitch to her shawl, Cadsuane herself drifted away into the crowd. Min swallowed the lump in her throat and was pleased to see Caroline do the same, self-possession or no. Rand, the blind fool, stared after the Aes Sedai as though intending to go after her. This time it was Caroline who laid a hand on Rand's chest. "I take it you know, Cadsuane," she said breathily. "Be careful of her. Even the other sisters stand in awe of her. Her throaty tones took on a note of gravity. I have no idea what will come of today, but whatever it is, I think it is time you were gone, Cousin Thomas. Past time. I will have horses. This is your cousin, Caroline, said a deep, rich man's voice, and Min jumped in spite of herself. Toram Rioton was even better looking close up than at a distance, with a sort of strong, and air of worldly knowledge that would have attracted Min before she met Rand. While she still found them attractive, just not as much as she did Rand. His firm-lipped smile was quite appealing. Toram's gaze fell to Caroline's hand, still on Rand's chest. The Lady Caroline is to be my wife, he said lazily. Did you know that? Caroline's cheeks reddened angrily. Do not say that, Toram. I have told you I will not, and I will not. Toram smiled at Rand. I think women never know their minds until you show them. What do you think, Jerael? Jerael? He looked around, scowling. Min stared at him in amazement. And he was so pretty, with just the right air of... She wished she could call up viewings at will. She very much wanted to know what the future held for this man. I saw your friend scurry off that way, Toram. Mouth twisted with distaste, Caroline gave a vague wave of her hand. You will find him near the drink, I think, or else bothering the serving girls. Later, my precious. He tried to touch her cheek and looked amused when she stepped back. Without a pause, he transferred his amusement to Rand, and the sword at his side. Would you care for a little sport, cousin? I call you that because we will be cousins once Caroline is my wife. With practice swords, of course. Certainly not, Caroline laughed. He is a boy, Toram, and scarce knows one end of that thing from the other. His mother would never forgive me if I allowed... Sport, Rand said abruptly. I might as well see where this leads. I agree. Chapter 36. Blades. Min did not know whether to groan or shout or sit down and cry. Caroline, staring wide-eyed at Rand, seemed in the same quandary. With a laugh, Toram began rubbing his hands together. Listen, everyone, he shouted. You are going to see some sport. Clear a space. Clear a space. He strode off, waving people away from the center of the tent. Sheep herder, Min growled. You're not wool-brained. You don't have any brains. I would not put it quite so, Caroline said in a very dry voice. But I suggest you leave now. Whatever tricks you think you might use, there are 7 Aes Sedai in this tent. 4 of them Red Aja lately arrived from the south on their way to Tarvalon. Should one of them so much as suspect, I very much fear that whatever might have come of today never will. Leave. I won't use any tricks. Rand unbuckled his sword belt and handed it to Min. If I've touched you and Darlin in one way, maybe I can touch Toram in another. The crowd was pushing back, opening up an area 20 paces across between 2 of the great center poles. Some looked to Rand, and there was a great deal of rib-nudging and sly laughter. The Aes Sedai were offered pride of place, of course. Cadsuane and her 2 friends on one side, 4 ageless women in red Aja shawls on the other. Cadsuane and her companions were eyeing Rand with open disapproval, and as close to irritation as any Aes Sedai ever let show, but the Red Sisters looked more concerned with those 3. At least, although they stood directly opposite, they managed to seem oblivious of the presence of any other sisters. No one could be that blind without trying. Listen to me, cousin. Caroline's low voice almost crackled with urgency. She stood very close, her neck craned to look up at him. Barely reaching his chest, she seemed ready to box his ears. If you use none of your tricks, Caroline went on, he can hurt you badly, even with practice swords, and he will. He has never liked another touching what he thinks is his, and he suspects every pretty young man who speaks to me of being my lover. When we were children, he pushed a friend down the stairs and broke his back, because Darrowin rode his pony without asking. Go, cousin. No one will think less. No one expects a boy to face a blade master. Jaisi, whatever your real name is, help me convince him. Min opened her mouth, and Rand laid a finger across her lips. I am who I am, he smiled, and I don't think I could run from him if I wasn't. So he's a blade master. Unbuttoning his coat, he strode out into the cleared area. Why must they be so stubborn when you least wish it? Caroline whispered in tones of frustration. Min could only nod in agreement. Toram had stripped to shirt and breeches and carried 2 practice swords, their blades bundles of thin laths tied together. He raised an eyebrow at the sight of Rand with his coat simply hanging open. You will be confined in that, cousin. Rand shrugged. Without warning, Toram tossed one of the swords. Rand caught it out of the air by the long hilt. Those gloves will slip, cousin. You want a firm grip. Rand took the hilt in both hands and turned slightly sideways, blade down and left foot forward. Toram spread his hands as if to say he had done all he could. Well, at least he knows how to stand, he laughed, and on the last word darted forward, practice sword streaking for Rand's head with all his might behind it. With a loud clack, bundled blades met bundled blades. Rand had moved nothing except his sword. For a moment, Toram stared at him, and Rand looked back calmly. Then they began to dance. That was all men could call it, that gliding, flowing movement, wooden blades flickering and spinning. She had watched Rand practice the sword against the best he could find, often against 2 or 3 or 4 at once, but that had been nothing to this. So beautiful, and so easy to forget that had those lathes been steel, blood could have flowed, except that no blade, steel or lathes, touched flesh. Back and forth they danced, circling one another, swords now probing, now slashing, Rand attacking, now defending, and every movement punctuated by those loud clacks. Caroline gripped Min's arm hard without taking her eyes from the contest. He is also a blade master, she breathed. He must be. Look at him. Min was looking, and hugging Rand's sword belt and scabbarded blade as if they were him. Back and forth in beauty, and whatever Rand thought, Toram clearly wished his blade was steel. Cold rage burned on his face, and he pressed harder, harder. Still no blade touched anything but another, yet now Rand backed away constantly, sword darting to defend, and Toram moved forward, attacking, eyes glittering with icy fury. Outside, someone screamed, a wail of utter horror, and suddenly the huge tent snapped up into the air, vanishing into a thick grayness that hid the sky. Fog billowed on every side, filled with distant shrieks and bellows. Thin tendrils wafted into the clear, inverted bowl left by the tent. Everyone stared in amazement. Almost everyone. Toram's lathe blade smashed into Rand's side with a bone-crack sound, doubling him over. You are dead, cousin, Toram sneered, lifting his sword high to strike again, and froze, staring, as part of the heavy gray mist overhead solidified. A tentacle of fog it might have been, a thick, 3-toed arm reaching down, closed around the stout red sister, snatching her into the air before anyone had a chance to move. Katsuane was the first to overcome shock. Her arms rose, shaking back her shawl. Her hands made a twist, and a ball of fire seemed to shoot upward from each palm, streaking into the mist. Above, something suddenly burst into flame, one violent gout that vanished immediately, and the red sister fell back into sight, dropping with a thud face down on the carpets near where Rand knelt on one knee, clutching his side. At least she would have been face down, had not her head been twisted around so her dead eyes stared up into the fog. Whatever scraps of composure remained in the tent fled with that. The shadow had been given flesh. Screaming people fled in every direction, knocking over tables, nobles clawing past servants, and servants past nobles. Buffeted, men fought her way to Rand with fists and elbows and his sword as a club. Are you all right? She asked, pulling him to his feet. She was surprised to see Caroline on the other side, helping him too. For that matter, Caroline looked surprised. He took his hand from beneath his coat, fingers thankfully free of blood. That half-healed scar, so tender, had not broken open. "I think we best move," he said, taking his sword belt. "We have to get out of this." The inverted bowl of clear air was noticeably smaller. Almost everyone else had fled. Out in the fog, screams rose, most cutting off abruptly, but always replaced by new. "I agree, Thomas," Darlin said. Sword in hand, he planted himself with his back to Caroline, between her and the fog. "The question is, in which direction? And also, how far do we have to go?" "This is his work," Toram spat. "Althor's." Hurling down his practice sword, he stalked to his discarded coat and calmly donned it. Whatever else he was no coward. "Jerael!" he shouted at the fog as he fastened his sword belt. "Jerael, the light burn you man, where are you? Jerael!" Mordeth, Fane, did not answer, and he went on shouting. The only others still there were Cadsuane and her two companions, faces calm, but hands running nervously over their shoulders. Cadsuane herself might have been setting out for a stroll. "I should think north," she said. "The slope lies closer that way, and climbing may take us above this." "Stop that caterwauling, Toram. Either your man's dead or he can't hear." Toram glared at her, but he did stop shouting. Cadsuane did not appear to notice or care, so long as he was silent. "North, then. We three will take care of anything your steel can't handle." She looked straight at Rand when she said that, and he gave a whisker of a nod before buckling his sword belt and drawing his blade. Trying not to goggle, Min exchanged glances with Caroline. The other woman's eyes looked as large as teacups. The Aes Sedai knew who he was, and she was going to keep anyone else from knowing. "I wish we had not left our warders back in the city," the slim yellow sister said. Tiny silver bells in her dark hair chimed as she tossed her head. She had almost as commanding an air as Cadsuane, enough that you did not realize how pretty she was at first, except that that toss of her head seemed, well, a touch petulant. "I wish I had Roshan here." "A circle, Cadsuane?" the gray asked. Head turning this way and that to peer at the fog, she looked like a plump, pale-haired sparrow with her sharp nose and inquisitive eyes. Not a frightened sparrow, but one definitely ready to take wing. "Should we link?" "No, Nianda," Cadsuane sighed. "If you see something, you must be able to strike at it without waiting to point it out for me. Samitsu, stop worrying about Roshan. We have 3 fine swords here. 2 of them heron mark, I see. They will do." Toram showed his teeth on seeing the heron engraved on the blade Rand had unsheathed. If it was a smile, it held no mirth. His own bared blade bore a heron, too. Darlin's did not, but he gave Rand and his sword a weighing look, then a respectful nod that was considerably deeper than he had offered plain Thomas Trakand of a minor branch of the house. The gray-haired green had taken charge, and she kept it despite attacks from Darlin, who, like many tyrants, seemed not to relish Aes Sedai a great deal, and Toram, who just didn't dislike anyone giving orders. For that matter, so did Caroline. Cadsuane ignored her frowns as completely as she did the men's voiced complaints. Unlike them, Caroline appeared to realize complaints would do no good. Wonder of wonders, Rand let himself be placed to Cadsuane's right as she quickly arranged everyone. Well, not exactly meekly. He stared down his nose at her in a way that would have made Min slap him if he did it to her. Cadsuane just shook her head and muttered something that reddened his face, but at least he kept his mouth shut. Right then, Min almost thought he would announce who he was, and maybe expect the fog to vanish in fear of the dragon reborn. He smiled at her as though fog in this weather was nothing, even a fog that snatched tents and people. They moved into the thick mist in a formation like a 6-pointed star, Cadsuane herself in the lead, and Aes Sedai at each of 2 other points, a man with a sword at 3. Toram, of course, protect.
Alright, everyone, I'm gonna call into this stream for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Excuse me.